She survived 18 stab wounds to the neck, throat, back, and hands. She walked out of the apartment at approximately 3 in the morning, bleeding through her clothes, with no phone, no identification, no way to call for help. She spent the next 2 hours begging strangers on the streets of São Gonçalo, Rio de Janeiro, to dial the emergency number. Most of them walked away. Some of them filmed her on their phones instead. And while she was dragging herself toward a bus depot, hoping a shift worker might take pity on her, the man who had done this was back in the apartment, lying down and going to sleep. In the days that followed, when her family began circulating missing person photographs on WhatsApp, he reposted them himself. He answered their calls. He drove with them to the police station to file a report. He sat in rooms with the people who loved her and performed the role of a devastated, confused boyfriend with what every account suggests was extraordinary composure. What he did not know, because he had let her leave in a condition he assumed was unsurvivable, was that she had already been found. She had arrived at a state hospital without a single document on her body, unable to speak clearly, and had been admitted as an unidentified patient. Her family did not know she was there. The police did not know she was there. For 4 days, she existed in a kind of legal and social void, alive barely and invisible to everyone who was looking for her. I've been doing this long enough to understand that violence rarely announces itself. But this case, the more I read into it, the more I kept returning to one question. How does a 42-year-old man stab someone 18 times, attempt to smother her with a pillow, watch her walk out the door soaked in blood, and then spend the following week performing grief without a single visible crack? That question is what this episode is about. My name is Harrison Cross, and this is the Blackout Tapes. Tonight, we are in São Gonçalo, in the metropolitan region of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, in November of 2022. The victim is Mariana da Silva Ribeiro, 30 years old. The accused is Aldemir Carneiro de Oliveira, 42 years old. The charge is attempted feminicide, the attempted killing of a woman because she is a woman. Mariana lived. She spent 43 days in the hospital, 4 of them in a medically induced coma, and she has since spoken publicly about what happened with a clarity and a detail that I think makes this one of the most thoroughly documented cases of its kind in recent Brazilian criminal history. I want to be direct about something before we go further. What you're going to hear tonight did not come out of nowhere. This was not a sudden break in an otherwise stable relationship. The evidence, the court records, the victim's own testimony, and the forensic profile all point to the same conclusion. The night of November 15th was the end of a 2-year escalation. Understanding that is the only way to understand how this happened. To understand what occurred in that apartment, we have to go back to sometime around 2020, before Mariana had any idea who Aldemir Carneiro de Oliveira was. Mariana's life before this relationship matters because it pushes back against an assumption that gets attached to domestic violence cases more often than it should. That victims are somehow predisposed, that there is a type, that something in a person draws the violence toward them. The record on Mariana does not support that at all. By her own account, and by every external description, she was a woman with a demanding career in event promotion, working across multiple cities, a wide social network, and a previous marriage of nearly 7 years that she described as entirely healthy and without violence. She had 2 children. She had separated from her first husband around 2018 and spent the following years focused on work, her kids, and her friendships. She was not looking for a serious relationship when she encountered Aldemir. That detail matters more than it might initially seem. They were introduced through a mutual friend, a woman who shared a social circle with Aldemir and whose home Mariana visited frequently for work-related reasons. In the beginning, Mariana and Aldemir were simply 2 single adults who ran in the same circles and discovered they had compatible social energy. There was no immediate romantic intent on either side. The initial phase was what Mariana described as a loosely defined friendship between two people who liked the same kinds of outings, who shared a similar rhythm in social settings, and who gravitated toward each other without either party attaching particular significance to it. This is worth noting. The relationship did not begin with intensity or urgency. It began with the slow and deceptively natural accumulation of shared experience, which is precisely how these situations tend to begin. Court records and witness accounts describe Aldemir during this period as emotionally reserved and flat when discussing his personal history. He spoke about his ex-wife without sentiment, neither warmly nor with visible hostility. He mentioned estrangement from his family as a plain fact, without drama attached. What he was constructing, though Mariana had no frame of reference to see it at the time, was a very specific image, a man who was competent, functional, and profoundly alone. That image would be weaponized against her consistently over the following 2 years. What I find most revealing about Aldemir's background, looking at the documented record, is the distance between his public profile and the private reality that multiple women would eventually describe. He was a civil engineer. Employment records confirm he had professional ties to the Tribunal de Justiça do Estado do Rio de Janeiro, the state court system. He had also served as a city councilman in Guajará-Mirim, in the state of Rondônia, in the legislative term from 2005 to 2008, with subsequent administrative processes related to that tenure documented in court records. He was, in short, a man who had navigated formal institutional structures at multiple levels. He understood rules, he understood systems, he understood how to present himself within them. Forensic psychology has a specific term for this kind of profile, the Mask of Sanity. And this case illustrates it clearly. The individuals most capable of sustained domestic violence are frequently not the ones who appear unstable in public. They are the ones who are visibly stable in every other context, who sit across tables from colleagues and neighbors and family members and give no readable indication of what happens behind a closed door. There is also something in the case file about Aldemir's physical and psychological state during this period that I think deserves attention. He maintained a noticeably muscular build and was suspected of using anabolic steroids. He was also taking prescription medication that Mariana described as either an anxiolytic or a mood-stabilizing compound for what she understood to be depression or hormonal regulation. I'm not claiming that substance use caused what he did. The forensic evidence does not support that reduction, and it would be irresponsible to suggest it. But the medical and criminological literature is consistent that steroidal compounds combined with certain psychiatric medications can create significant mood dysregulation and intensify paranoia and aggression in individuals who already carry violent predispositions. It is one element in a larger picture. When Mariana and Aldemir formalized their relationship and began appearing together publicly, people who knew both of them described a couple with an unusual social energy. They fit together, they animated rooms, mutual friends wanted to be around them. This phase in the behavioral research on coercive control has a name: love bombing. It is a concentrated period in which the perpetrator performs an idealized version of partnership with such intensity that it creates a deep emotional anchor in the victim. Mariana would spend the next 2 years reaching back toward that original image every time the violence receded and the performance resumed. That is not a coincidence or a character flaw. That is the design. The first overt act of violence did not arrive as a blow. It arrived as a grip on her arm and a raised voice in a crowded nightclub. Aldemir grabbed her hard enough and yelled loudly enough that a friend who witnessed the incident pulled Mariana aside afterward and told her he had not liked what he had seen. Mariana told investigators and in recorded interviews that she had not registered the incident as alarming while it was happening. She had already, within the early months of the relationship, shifted her threshold for acceptable behavior without noticing it move. A mutual friend's alarm was the first external signal that what she was experiencing was outside the range of normal, and she did not act on it. I say this not critically, but because it is exactly what the behavioral research predicts. By the time the first observable act of violence occurs in these relationships, the cognitive groundwork has already been laid thoroughly enough that the victim's ability to interpret warning signs has been significantly compromised. The perpetrator has spent months calibrating the acceptable threshold upward, incrementally, until something a stranger immediately identifies as alarming reads to the person inside the relationship as a rough moment, a mood, a minor excess. The escalation from verbal aggression and physical grabbing to direct facial violence followed a pattern documented in the court materials and corroborated by multiple witnesses. The first recorded instance of Aldemir striking Mariana in the face occurred in a specific context that reveals the logic of the violence clearly. They had separated. Mariana called him one day, a Monday or Tuesday by her recollection, to tell him she would be coming by his apartment to collect the rest of her belongings. He said that was fine. When she arrived, she found that he had prepared a full dinner for her, set the table, done things he was not in the habit of doing. She told him she had not come for dinner, that she had only come for her things. He pressed her to stay. She relented and spent the night. In the morning, during a discussion, she mentioned that she had spent a good weekend with friends during their time apart. He struck her across the face. She left immediately and did not file a report. The structure of that sequence is important. He did not call her back with an honest proposal. He created a situation using the occasion of her own errand, her own stated intention to collect belongings, to manufacture proximity, then romantic context, then an overnight, and then, when she referenced her autonomous life, punished her for it. The violence was not an emotional eruption. It was a correction. The pattern continued and accelerated. There was an episode in a vehicle following an evening out in Niterói, during which Aldemir drove at what witnesses described as terrifying speed through urban streets, struck Mariana with his forearm inside the car, and then, after arriving at their destination, threw her bag, her makeup, and her phone into the street and drove the car over her belongings repeatedly. He then physically blocked and intimidated rideshare drivers who attempted to stop and assist her. A friend who was present in that vehicle corroborated this in testimony. No emergency services were called. There was an incident in Mariana's own home, with her mother on the other side of a closed door, during which Aldemir overturned a full-sized bed, ripped a wooden door frame fixture from the wall, and struck Mariana across the head with it. The wound bled heavily. Her mother knocked and called out, asking for less noise. Mariana told her everything was fine. Aldemir then lay down on the floor, placed his hands over his head, and began crying. He said he deserved to be arrested. He said he had nothing and no one. He said she was the only person who had ever cared for him. Mariana, bleeding from a head wound, ended up holding him. And then there was the strangulation. On a separate occasion, with her brother present in the house, Mariana was found unconscious. Her brother carried her to her bed. When she came around, the bruising on her face and around her neck was, in her brother's assessment, inconsistent with a simple fainting episode. He told her plainly, "You were knocked out." When she later confided in him about the pattern of what had been happening, he told Aldemir to stop coming to the house. Within a short period, Aldemir was back. Mariana brought him back. She has said publicly that she does not have a clean explanation for why, and I think that honesty is more useful than any theory I could supply, because it reflects what trauma bonding actually looks like from inside it. I want to note something about strangulation specifically, because the forensic literature is unambiguous on this point. Non-fatal strangulation is considered one of the single most reliable statistical predictors of future homicide or attempted homicide in domestic violence cases. The sustained intentionality required to compress another person's airway until they lose consciousness places this category of violence apart from other forms of physical assault. Aldemir had already done this to Mariana. The trajectory from that moment forward was documented long before November 15th. The weeks immediately preceding the crime require close attention because they explain how Mariana came to be alone in that apartment. She had, by her own account, made a genuine internal break from the relationship. She described herself as having understood, finally and fully, that there was no version of this that worked. She was moving forward, and then Aldemir was injured in a car accident. One that investigators noted he had caused himself by driving at excessive speed, a behavioral pattern entirely consistent with his profile. He had fractured ribs. He contacted Mariana and asked her to take him to a doctor. She did. Once at his apartment, he asked her to stay through his recovery because, as he had told her many times before, there was no one else. She agreed. She remained at his apartment for more than a week. She told a friend by phone during that period, and this is documented in the court materials, that she did not know what she was doing there, that she felt no love for him anymore, that she was simply performing a basic act of charity for a man she knew to be alone. That is not a return to the relationship. That is a woman who had rebuilt enough of her own footing to see the situation clearly, being drawn back in by the same mechanism that had operated from the beginning, his constructed helplessness. During that period of cohabitation, the dynamic inevitably reverted. On November 11th, 4 days before the attack, Aldemir coerced Mariana into posting a couple's photograph to her Instagram account. When she attempted to limit the audience to a small private list of close contacts, a setting that also removes the ability for others to share the post. Aldemir noticed what she was doing and insisted she remove the restriction and post it publicly. Her social network, people who believed she had finally separated from him, saw the photograph and were surprised. Some sent messages expressing concern. It was not a reconciliation she had chosen. It was a performance she had been required to give. That same evening, while Aldemir had told Mariana he was going out with male friends from a venue connected to the music industry, phone records accessed during the investigation established that he had submitted his own name alongside the name of another woman to a VIP guest list at a nightclub. He was not with friends. Mariana would not discover this until 5 days later. The night of November 15th began without incident. They went to a bar together. The mood, by her account, was genuinely comfortable. Her last outbound communication to a friend was logged at 9:06 in the evening, a message saying the car had arrived and she was heading out. The last photograph of them together was taken at 12:26 in the morning, inside the venue. At some point before that photograph, Mariana had suggested moving to an adjacent bar with more energy. Witnesses noted that Aldemir's demeanor shifted when she made this suggestion. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have alarmed a stranger. A tightening, a cooling. Mariana recognized the signs and redirected. They left. Back at the apartment, Aldemir's brother was traveling. They were alone. Aldemir lay down on a mattress on the floor of the bedroom. Mariana, still awake, picked up his phone. The device had no significant security obstruction at that moment. She found the messages from 5 days earlier. The guest list request, his name alongside another woman's, the record of exactly what she had suspected. She confronted him. By her recollection, she was clear and final. She told him she could see why they never worked, that he was a liar, that there was no way forward. Then she walked to the window of the small studio apartment to smoke a cigarette. What happened next is detailed in the forensic record, corroborated by Mariana's testimony and consistent with every piece of medical evidence recovered at the hospital. Aldemir came into the kitchen. He picked up a large kitchen knife from the counter. He moved toward Mariana, who had her back to him, facing the window. She sensed him and turned. She saw the knife. She spoke to him without panic. She told him he was losing his mind, that his parents lived across the street, that there were neighbors nearby, and she told him to put it away. He held the position for a moment, then he turned, walked back to the counter, and returned the large knife to its place. What Mariana did not see, because his back was to her, was that he then reached for a second knife, smaller, a paring knife with a pointed tip, and slid it into his pocket. He returned to the mattress. He called to her in a quieter voice and asked her to come in and talk. The behavioral sequence I just described is the center of the case, and I want to be direct about what it means. A person experiencing a genuine acute psychotic break does not display a weapon, accept a verbal correction, visibly comply, and then covertly arm himself with a concealed alternative before luring the victim into an enclosed space under the cover of a calm tone of voice. Every element of that sequence requires active planning, inhibitory control, and a functioning awareness of consequence and concealment. The defense would later argue in preliminary proceedings that Aldemir had suffered a sudden psychotic episode. The documented behavior in the minutes before the first wound does not support that. It describes premeditation. Mariana entered the bedroom and sat down on the mattress, facing him. He drew the knife and struck. The exact anatomical sequence of the opening strikes is not established with precision because the attack was immediate and destabilizing. What the medical record does establish is that among the 18 wounds catalogued at the hospital, several were directed at the throat and the structures of the esophagus and larynx, and at least one caused sufficient damage that Mariana was physiologically incapable of producing a scream from the early moments of the attack. She had been silenced. Whether the targeting was deliberate or a function of the angle and momentum of the first strikes, I cannot state as fact. What I can state is that the outcome, a victim inside a residential apartment building who could not cry out, served the attacker's interests completely. Mariana fell forward onto the mattress. He positioned himself across her lower back, seated, and used one hand to pull her hair back while continuing to strike with the other. The medical examiner's findings, as referenced in the 500-page court file, document wounds across the neck, upper back, shoulders, and the arms and hands she raised behind her head in a defensive posture. One of those defensive wounds resulted in permanent tendon and nerve damage to a finger that no longer bends. He then set the knife aside and pressed a pillow over her face and the back of her head, attempting to smother her in the pool of blood that had accumulated beneath her on the mattress. At some point in this sequence, Mariana made a decision. I'm going to try to describe it precisely because I think misrepresenting it would be a disservice. She controlled her breathing to the extent that adrenaline and blood loss would allow. She let her body go still. She reduced the visible signs of consciousness and performed death. He paused. She felt the pressure shift. She spoke. She told him she loved him. She told him he was right and she had deserved this. She said she needed a hospital and that she would tell them she had been robbed on the street. She brought up his daughter. She brought up her own children, and she offered him the one thing she calculated he might value above her death: freedom from consequence. He responded. He said she could go, and she walked out. What followed in the streets of São Gonçalo in the hours between approximately 3 and 5 in the morning is a separate testimony about what communities become when the fear of organized violence overrides all other instinct. The area near Aldemir's apartment was proximate to a neighborhood under the operational control of a drug trafficking faction. People who saw Mariana, a woman in blood-soaked clothes, her hands pressed to the wounds on her throat, her voice barely audible, assumed she was the result of a factional matter and turned away. Drivers swerved around her when she stepped into the road. People held up their phones and recorded. No one dialed 193, the fire department emergency line. The omission is documented. Not one call was made. She reached the gates of a bus depot as the first light of dawn was beginning, reasoning that workers arriving for early shifts might respond differently than nighttime pedestrians. By the time she arrived, she was suffering from acute systemic blood loss. She collapsed against the metal grating. A man in the security booth, an older gentleman whose face she says she cannot recall because she could barely lift her head, told her through the barrier that he had already called for help and that she needed to hold on a little longer. The fire department rescue team arrived. As they cut away her clothing and began triage, she talked. She gave them Aldemir's name. She gave them his phone number. She gave them his address. She told them she had not been robbed. She made sure, before she could no longer sustain speech, that the record of who had done this existed in someone else's hands. She was transported to Hospital Estadual Alberto Torres, taken directly into surgery, and placed in a medically induced coma. She carried no identification. She was admitted as an unidentified patient. For 4 days, from the perspective of her family, her friends, and every formal record, she had simply vanished. During those 4 days, Aldemir operated with a coherence that I find, frankly, more disturbing than the attack itself. He still had her phone. He used it to construct a false record, sending messages from her device and from his own to fabricate the appearance of a post-argument departure, leaving a trail designed to suggest she had walked out on her own and gone silent. When her friends and family began posting her photograph on social media as a missing person, he reposted those photographs. He answered calls from her family. He drove with them to the police district to file a report about her disappearance. He suggested possible explanations. He expressed concern. And at no point during any of this, according to every account, did his behavior raise enough alarm to cause anyone to name him as a suspect directly. Because he had not yet been named by the only person who could name him, and he believed she was dead. A community alert network in São Gonçalo eventually connected the circulating photographs to the unidentified patient at Hospital Estadual Alberto Torres. When Mariana came out of the coma, her brother was at her bedside. Her first coherent act was to confirm, without hesitation, what she had told the fire department rescue team before losing consciousness. Aldemir had done this. When word spread among the family that she had been found and had spoken, Aldemir arrived at the hospital. Based on the sequence of events reconstructed from witness accounts, it appears he did not know yet that she had regained consciousness and given a statement. He came into the external corridor of the intensive care unit and encountered her brother, who had just come down from Mariana's room carrying the full weight of what she had told him. Aldemir extended his hand and asked how she was doing. Her brother held himself. Her uncle did not. He applied a physical restraint hold and struck Aldemir repeatedly in the hallway. Under the force of that confrontation, surrounded by family members who now knew, Aldemir confessed. Security and police who were present at the hospital took him into custody and transported him to the 74th Police District. At the precinct, the duty officer released him. This decision generated significant public outrage, and I think it is worth explaining exactly why it happened, because the explanation does not make it less troubling. It just makes it legible. Under Article 302 of the Brazilian Code of Criminal Procedure, a flagrant arrest requires either active pursuit or apprehension at or immediately after the scene of the crime. The attack had occurred 4 days earlier. Without that legal predicate, and without a judicial warrant yet in hand, the investigation had barely had time to formally open, and seeking a preventive detention order against a man with institutional connections to the court system itself required time and documentation the police did not yet have. The release was technically within the law. The family was terrified. The media covered the release extensively. A preventive detention warrant was subsequently sought through the court and executed. Aldemir did not remain free for long, and not entirely because of the legal process. The trafficking faction that controlled the territory around his home sent a message through intermediaries. If they found him before law enforcement did, they intended to do to him what he had done to Mariana. Faced with that alternative, his defense attorneys arranged a surrender. He was formally taken into custody under a preventive detention order, and the case was transferred to the Delegacia de Atendimento a Mulher de São Gonçalo, the specialized women's violence unit, in coordination with other precincts. It is being prosecuted before the Tribunal de Justiça do Estado do Rio de Janeiro, under case number 0812739-2.8.19.00004 on the charge of attempted feminicide. The defense has attempted two primary theories. The first was self-defense, articulated at certain points with the qualifier of honor, a legally discredited and constitutionally prohibited formulation under Brazilian criminal law. The medical evidence dismantles it. Aldemir had no documented defensive wounds, no cuts, no bruising consistent with a two-way physical struggle. Mariana was on her stomach, below him, for the majority of the attack. The second theory was acute psychotic break, arguing that Aldemir lost contact with reality and could not be held fully accountable for what he did in that dissociated state. I have already walked through the behavioral sequence that refutes this at its foundation. I want to add only one element from the case record. In the hours after the attack, while Mariana was on the street dying, Aldemir was inside the apartment managing his phone communications and constructing a cover narrative. Those are not the actions of a man who had just lost his grip on reality. Those are the actions of a man who believed he had committed a perfect crime and was closing the perimeter around it. My reading of the case, and I want to be clear, this is interpretation rather than established fact, is that Aldemir let Mariana leave because he believed she would not survive long enough to reach anyone who could help her, and that if she died in the street, the geography of that neighborhood, the proximity to drug trafficking territory, the absence of witnesses willing to involve themselves, would absorb the crime. She simply did not die the way he expected. The distance she covered, bleeding in the dark, in a neighborhood designed by circumstance to refuse her help, to reach a security booth where one person was paying enough attention to call for rescue. I do not have a word adequate to that. Mariana spent 43 days at Hospital Estadual Alberto Torres. She underwent emergency surgery and multiple sessions of renal dialysis after her kidneys failed from blood loss. She contracted a severe pulmonary infection during her stay. She refused antidepressants. She returned to her children. She returned to her ex-husband, who had remained close to her family throughout the entire ordeal. She has given detailed public interviews. She appeared in court during the preliminary hearings and looked at Aldemir across a courtroom without looking away. She continues to speak. The jury trial has not yet occurred as of the time of this recording. At the hearing where Mariana gave her most recent deposition, Aldemir's mother was also present. She approached Mariana in the corridor and asked to speak. She apologized, and Mariana has said publicly that she accepted the apology. The mother then added that she hoped Mariana would refrain from continuing to speak publicly about the case, because her son's father was in poor health and the exposure was causing the family suffering. Mariana did not accept that part. I think that exchange captures something worth sitting with. The people around men like this frequently do not deny the violence. They simply ask the victim to absorb it quietly on behalf of the family's dignity. Mariana refused. She keeps refusing. The case file of Mariana da Silva Ribeiro against Aldemir Carneiro de Oliveira stands as one of the most thoroughly documented attempted feminicides in recent Brazilian criminal history. Not because the violence in it is unusual. It is not, and that is the terrible truth of it. But because the victim survived with her account intact, legally corroborated at every material point, and her willingness to remain visible entirely undiminished. The trial will be decided by a jury. I think they will hear the facts clearly. The facts are not in dispute in any serious way. What is in dispute, and what the defense will continue to argue, is whether the man who selected a concealed weapon, lured a woman into a confined space, and stabbed her 18 times while seated on her back deserves to be understood as someone who was temporarily not himself. I think the record answers that. The record suggests he was entirely himself. This is the Blackout Tapes. I am Harrison Cross. We will be back.